cover land conservation, transportation, and land use, but mainly transportation. And also we're going to cover some climate issues. You have three great speakers today in Nikki Rovner, Trip Pollard, and DeJuan Robinson. Just first to frame it.
Just a brief reminder of how we got here. This tax credit was created in 2000. It passed unanimously. It was very generous. It was 50% of the value of the donation. And then it was made transferable in 2002. That also passed unanimously. And of course, the sponsor of that legislation was Bill Howell, who then became Speaker shortly thereafter. And then in 2006, there was a last-minute budget compromise. That was the year that the legislature didn't even pass the budget until June. And they passed two other pieces of legislation at the time, and one had to do with the estate tax, and the other had to do with the land preservation tax credit. And it was actually a pretty bad piece of legislation, but Governor Kane was able to amend it to make it a whole lot better. It reduced the donation value that you would get in your tax credit to 40%, and it placed a $100 million cap on the program. But that $100 million cap had a CPI adjustment in it, so it would grow every year with the Consumer Price Index. This is an awesome program that we should all be really proud of, and this map shows why. The amount of land conserved in Virginia all over the state has increased tremendously since this program was enacted. And you can see the counties that had only a few acres of land conserved back in 2000. Many of them in 2012 have much more acreage conserved. So it's been a very successful program. Only purpose of this slide is to say it is a big program. It does cost the state a lot of money, and that's why we have to be really careful about protecting it, because there are some legislators who are really skeptical of the program because of the fact that it is $100 million plus that is coming out of the Treasury every year in support of this program. Now, it's a 40% tax credit, so for every $100 million the state spends, it's getting $250 million worth of land conservation. So it's totally worth it in our view, of course. But it does bring some scrutiny to the program. And there have been a couple recent studies. One was a Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission study. That study actually found that this was a great program. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. They looked at a bunch of other tax preferences that maybe aren't doing exactly what they're supposed to do. For example, the coal jobs enhancement tax credit. Not such a great program if you look at it based on objective criteria. But this program is very successful. There's also this Joint Commission on Tax Preferences that was created about a year ago. And that was a recommendation of the JLARC study, and it said the legislature should start to review all the tax preferences, not just tax credits, but income tax deductions and sales tax exemptions, everything, and scrutinize them and decide which ones are doing the job and which ones aren't, and get rid of the ones that aren't doing their job. Well, I didn't mean to do that. That's a lot easier said than done, and that thing has been sputtering all year, and it met last week, tried to come up with a plan for next year. The staff recommended that they look at the 10 biggest tax preferences, and they couldn't even agree on that. And I'm actually kind of glad, because the 10th biggest tax preference is the land preservation tax credit. I think if they did take a closer look at it, they find it is doing its job, and they wouldn't want to do anything to harm the program, but still, we don't need to have to focus on that kind of defense. There was also a study that I'll talk about in a minute that compared the tax credit with our land conservation grant programs. Now, this is a preview, right? I'm supposed to be telling you about what we should be looking for this coming year. I am pleased to say I haven't seen any land preservation tax credit legislation introduced this year, so we need to look back at last year in order to think about what we ought to be looking for. There was a bill to just repeal the whole thing last year. And unfortunately, that was introduced by Chris Jones, who is now the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, as was recently announced. So we do have some people in the legislature who are skeptical about this program. I don't expect to see another repeal bill this year, but you never know. We're going to have to look for it. We're going to have to make sure that it's not introduced. There was also a bill that would have put a sunset on all tax credits. Senator Peterson introduced that bill. It would have been a constitutional amendment, and it passed the committee vote, but it was killed on the Senate floor. There are some rational reasons to think it's a good idea to put sunsets on tax incentives. It would force the legislature to look at them. We opposed it on the basis that it was sort of creating an artificial crisis, kind of like what keeps happening in Congress over and over again with, no, enough said. So we would prefer the legislature to take an honest look at these things without creating this sort of crisis where the program would just automatically go away unless they do something. There is also a bunch of legislation, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but these slides are going to be posted after this event, that is well-meaning, but actually would have negative consequences. And so these are some other types of bills that intended to improve the program, but they actually would have done more harm than good, and none of these bills passed. As I mentioned, there was one other study I wanted to talk about, in which JLARC was asked to look at ways to fund land conservation because Virginia, even though it has this great tax credit, does not provide direct funding for land conservation at any significant level. And we really differ from our neighboring states in this regard. And as you can see from this pie chart, almost all the funding that's gone into land conservation between 2002 and 2011 was the land preservation tax credit. And we don't want to reduce that at all. We don't want to reduce that success. But there are a lot of conservation deals that could be happening in Virginia that can't happen because we don't have any funding. And in particular, it's public access projects that are not happening. There's no money for state parks. There's no money to acquire more state forests or local parks, wildlife management areas, natural area preserves. There have been bond issues in the past. There was one in 2008. There was one in 2002. That money's all gone. So in order to continue to provide the kind of recreational opportunities that our citizens demand, and we know that from outdoor surveys and other polls, there's got to be some direct funding to actually acquire land for public access, and it just hasn't been available. And so last year one bill did pass, and that was House Bill 1398. And what that bill did was change the tax credit program some. It said that there would now be a hard cap of $100 million. So it would no longer grow with that consumer price index over time. But that consumer price index adjusted amount would have to be appropriated by the governor to the grant programs, to the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, to the Civil War Sites Preservation Fund, and to the Office of Farmland Preservation. So for this year, the amount that we're looking for is $13.9 million. Now this bill says, and it passed the legislature pretty overwhelmingly, that the governor shall include this money in his budget. But we're waiting to see if he actually does it. And Nature Conservancy, PEC, lots of groups have been working really hard to influence the McDonnell administration to encourage them to include this money. It says that they have to, but there isn't really a remedy if they don't. We would just then have to go to the legislature and ask them to do it. So the two things that I want to leave you with are, number one, we need to keep our eye out for legislation that would actually get rid of or otherwise harm the tax credit program. And number two, we are hoping, praying, lobbying, doing all we can to make sure that this $13.9 million goes in the budget, that Governor McDonnell includes it in his outgoing budget, and if that doesn't happen, that the legislature then turns around and does what they said he was supposed to do and includes that funding. Thanks very much.
One of the interesting things about this coming session is that the transportation funding, at least the amount of funding and where it will come from, is not going to be a central issue like it has been the last few times I've been before you all on these legislative previews, because last session we had a massive transportation funding package pass the General Assembly, HB 2313. Now we are going to see some bills though on changes to HB 2313. I'm going to talk about these a little bit in a minute. There's also going to be some money bills dealing more with how we allocate money and how we prioritize money. Likely to be seeing some legislation again on the Public-Private Transportation Act and tolling, as well as reform of the Commonwealth Transportation Board and VDOT. And I'll say a little bit more about GDCs in a moment. And then, of course, all this takes place against the backdrop of a new administration coming in and policy changes that we may well be seeing both as soon as this administration takes office and certainly as the Assembly goes on to begin. So context on transportation, the big fight has been for a number of years the dwindling transportation resources, the fact that we weren't driving as much, the gas tax is our main source of transportation funding, it wasn't adjusted for inflation. Kind of an improbable set of circumstances got through last year a very complex package that is going to raise an estimated $6 billion of additional funding over the next 5 years alone. That's a statewide pot of money, and then there's also a separate, it includes a separate pot of money for Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. I'm not going to go into details of this, but it's a very complex package, included a whole lot of pieces, some of which VCN supported, some of which we opposed, many of you in this room opposed. Among other things, the package that did pass included a shift. They eliminated the retail gas tax, what you pay at the pump, the cents per gallon, which gave a lot of cover for some people to vote for this bill, but they replaced that with a wholesale gas tax. So there is still a gas tax, it's just not the one we had before. They also increased the sales tax, very aggressive, takes money from conservation, education, and other purposes. That's one of the things VCN opposed. We were successful in reducing the amount the governor wanted, but that was part of the package. Also included increased titling fees, the hybrid tax, many of you know about the ones we'll be talking about in a moment, so I'm not going to focus on that, as well as the regional taxes I mentioned in Hampton Roads and Northern Virginia. There's also a sleeper provision in there that's starting to get a little bit of attention. They allocated a chunk of money that Virginia expects to get if Congress allows it to impose the sales tax on internet sales. If Congress does not enact that, though, they put in here a hike in the gas tax if it's not approved by 2015. So that's kind of where all the money came from real quick. It increased funding for transit and passenger rail. Dulles Rail, for example, got a nice chunk of money. The passenger rail fund got a dedicated source of money. So there were some really good positive features to where the money goes, but it also greatly increased funding for road construction. And it was not much of a policy reform bill. It was mainly just about raising money. So given where we've been the last 4 years with this administration, not too surprising that this money has so far been mainly headed towards projects that we're not wild about. The McDonnell administration has continually emphasized what it calls mega projects. Charlottesville Bypass, the Outer Beltway, Bi-County Parkway, building a new 460, Coalfields Expressway, a whole number of projects that many of you have been involved in proposing. And to give you some sense of where they're putting their money, the Commonwealth Transportation Fund's budget for FY14 is $5.2 billion. VDOT is $4.7 billion. So we continue to emphasize pretty much one mode of construction. So that's kind of where we are. Looking ahead to this session, there are going to be bills to either repeal or modify this funding package. It was a very hard-fought, odd political alliances that passed this. The Republican Party actually was split among its legislators pretty much, and it passed with a combination of Republican and Democratic support. There are going to be some bills, already actually one introduced, to sunset and basically eliminate this as of next year, the whole package. There's also going to be, actually some are already getting submitted on this as well, bills to either repeal or delay that additional gas tax hike I mentioned if Congress fails to adopt that internet sales tax by 2015. Some measures that are already been introduced would just scrap that provision. Others would put it off till I think 2017, 2018. And then there are already a number of bills introduced to repeal the hybrid tax again, if you want us to talk more about that. Real quick, VCN's position applicable on some of these is in our transportation paper is we support eliminating the hybrid car tax. We also have been very interested in trying to allow, I mentioned those regional sales taxes and hotel taxes and the other. Hampton Roads is limited to roads only. The Northern Virginia one can be used for transit, rail, a whole host of projects. Hampton Roads is limited to road only. There's been a talk about trying to loosen that up. I don't know if there's actually going to be legislation this session because the votes simply are not there. Their delegation does like that limitation for roads as a whole. There's also been talk of adding Richmond as giving them a tax package as well, the regional taxes for Northern Virginia Hampton Roads. Part of VCN's position is we oppose that unless there are adequate provisions on things like transit funding, bicycle, pedestrian funding, and the like. Again, I'm not sure what kind of bill or momentum this is going to have this session. The delegation from Richmond has not been able to get their act together. And finally, in our position is that whatever we do, either tinkering with HB 2313 or anything else dealing with funding, is to provide increased funding for transit, bicycle, and pedestrian projects. So we are going to see this as an ongoing topic this session. Don't know the chances of getting many of these three that I mentioned at the top through. I think the hybrid tax actually has the best shot of repeal. There are also going to be some bills, though, on now that we have this big pot of money, how's this money going to be spent? There's already one bill introduced. There will be more, I'm sure. The bill on efforts from previous sessions, Delegate Lemonian, for example, had a bill. That they go to different pots of money, but they're all designed to try to tell either this Commonwealth Transportation Board or to tell these regional bodies that now have this funding how they spend their money. And the most popular measure that's being introduced by a number of folks is to say you have to prioritize spending that money on congestion relief. My concern is that how you apply it, could lead to less funding for transit, certainly would lead to less funding for bicycle and pedestrian projects. VCN position is to oppose any measure establishing funding priorities that does not include environmental quality, not just focusing on congestion. We've got to look at environmental impacts. And we also oppose any narrow definition of congestion relief that's solely limited to road construction, and there has been an attempt to do that. Another area dealing with money that I think we're going to see this session, possibly a bill on, there's a formula the General Assembly adopted a couple of years ago that directs up to $500 million once the maintenance money has been paid for to go for a formula that includes a big chunk of money for high priority projects, which is mainly meant these mega projects, new highways, constructed highways, to public-private transportation projects, and to bridge reconstruction. There's been a lot of talk about repealing that provision and just going back to the previous sets of formulas. There's also been talk to, at the very least, broaden this formula. Right now, the money that goes to primary roads, which is kind of the next category down, cities can't get that money because of the technicality in the law. These type of roads, when they enter a city, are actually called primary road extenders, not primary roads. And they're actually shut out right now of tapping this pot of money. So at the very least, I think there is going to be legislation to try to address this unintended problem, and that's something we would support. Again, VCN is looking through all of this to make sure we increase funding for alternatives to more and more highway construction. Another topic, passenger rail funding, that, as I mentioned, was part of that package that passed last session. So the main position of VCNs is to protect that money. Now that it was adopted, there are going to be some people looking to redirect it for other projects than rail. The way it passed actually is going to provide roughly $50 million a year for passenger rail in Virginia, which is actually a tremendously positive development. Puts us actually one of the highest in the country. And we're also going to, there may be a study bill to look at a rail authority to provide greater continuity and independence on policies and investments. I want to mention one other funding issue, and that's transit allocation. There was a bill that passed on performance measures that we're not opposed to, but the Department of Rail and Public Transit has been implementing this in a way that's made all of Northern Virginia furious, as well as some other localities. The CTB just adopted it this week. There may be a bill to try to reverse that. At the very least, I think there's going to be an administrative effort to try to reverse that. And finally, let me mention the Public-Private Transportation Act. For those of you who've heard me talk before, this is a kind of an ongoing struggle for us. Virginia has had more projects, public-private projects, than anyone else in the country. We've had a lot of problems with these. They've tended to fund only the most destructive projects. They have not lived up to their promise. There's been a huge explosion in use. There were only 4 completed to date since '96, but there's 7 underway, and there are 20 in the pipeline. Many of the problems are, as I mentioned, favors highway projects, shuts out the public, and on and on. There's a host of solutions. We released a report last year prepared by a consultant from Regenball. Talks about how we increase public participation and make this serve the public better. There was a minor reform bill that got through last session. We expect reform bills this session of various strength. Leave you with a few other topics just to look for. Speaker Howell has mentioned he wants to create some kind of innovation and tech fund. It will fund technology projects. We don't know what that's going to look like. Likely to be, there always are, bills to alter the composition of the Commonwealth Transportation Board. And budget amendments is a thing we have to look out for, both good ones on particular projects and also possibly ones trying to lock in some of these bad highway projects now that you've got a new administration that might try to undo them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Today to talk to you a little bit more about the hybrid tax repeal and the ongoing effort to study sea level rise or recurrent flooding in Virginia. Now, one of the ways that we can do to promote green communities, and we have heard several different aspects of that, several different ideas throughout the course of the day to promote green communities. One thing that we should do is stop punishing people who are trying to help. That is definitely true when it comes to the hybrid tax. Show of hands, how many of you own a hybrid vehicle? That's quite a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much for your service and for being good stewards of the environment. You can make your check payable of $64 to the Department of Motor Vehicles in Commonwealth of Virginia, because you will be soon paying, if you have not already paid, $64 extra per year when you go to register that hybrid vehicle. As Tripp talked about earlier, owners will start paying $64 for the hybrid tax as a part of Governor McDonnell's transportation plan that passed last year. Now, there are many reasons, I guess, for this. The idea was that hybrid owners pay, or they get better gas mileage, right? And so they fill up their tank less, so they're buying less gas. But they are using the roads just as much as everybody else. And so all of you free riders in here, you all need to start paying your fair share. And so we are going to tax you an extra $64 a year. That was the idea. It is terribly flawed in numerous ways, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. But as, again, Tripp mentioned, this is part of a big, big transportation funding package. And actually, the hybrid fee only accounts for about 2.5% of new funding for the next 5 years. So it is a very, very small amount that we're talking about. So why is the tax wrong? Clearly, because of climate benefits. Now, I know a lot of you all probably purchased a hybrid because you want to do your part and reduce your carbon footprint. This is a good thing that should be encouraged. But taxing that amounts to what Delegate Saravel has coined a tax on virtue. It would be as if we taxed you for buying fuel-efficient light bulbs, or if you had to pay to recycle. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but nevertheless, that's the idea. The third aspect of this is that it is a totally arbitrary tax. Now by this I mean, take for example a 2014 Toyota Highlander hybrid. Gets about 28 combined MPG. 2014 Lexus GS hybrid gets 23 combined MPG. 2014 Toyota Corolla gets 32 miles per gallon combined. Now again, so you could have, the idea is that hybrids use less gasoline. However, you can have a hybrid SUV, performance hybrid, an older model hybrid, 2002, 3, 4, 5, that actually gets less gas mileage than many newer cars. And so you are actually buying more gas and paying more gas taxes and are additionally slapped with a $64 hybrid fee, and that's unfair. So what are we doing about it? That is me staring aimlessly off in the distance with Senator Evan and Delegate Saravel. We held a press conference in Alexandria, at Alexandria DMV on July 1st when the tax came into effect to announce their repeal effort and to denounce the hybrid tax. And sure enough, just recently, Delegate Saravel and Senator Evan has put in a bill, HB4 and SB1, that repeals the hybrid tax, and this is a bill that you'll see for next session. Now, their bill goes a little bit beyond just repealing the hybrid tax, in that they are calling for a refund for those who already had to pay the unfair tax. So hopefully we can get support for that idea. I think that's a fantastic idea. Now, I put bipartisan support in asterisks because there is bipartisan support to repeal the tax. There have been numerous Republicans who are signing on to support, putting in their own version of the bill to repeal the hybrid tax. However, there is not as much support on the refund aspect. So we'll see what we can do on that. But nevertheless, the main idea of repealing the hybrid tax is gaining steam, and we're going to keep the pressure on through the General Assembly session in January. So, and unfortunately, because of our clean energy laws, we've already done quite a bit of damage, to our communities. And so, in addition to promoting best practices, which is what the hybrid tax repeal campaign is all about, we must also protect our communities from climate change impacts that we are already facing. And namely, I'm talking about, again, sea level rise or current flooding in Hampton Roads. And many of you have already seen this chart, but this was a chart put together by VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and they compiled data and put together the chart that you see behind me, projecting the amount of sea level rise that we're expected to see in Hampton Roads. Now, we all know what causes sea level rise. The ice caps melt, there's more water in the ocean because of warming, and the planet is warming, warmer water expands, seas rise. That's climate change 101, 10 seconds or less. I don't have a whole lot of time, so that's all you're going to get right now. But you got the general idea. However, unique to Norfolk and the Hampton Roads region is that the land is also sinking for a variety of reasons. And so that is what you see on this black line here, kind of the historic data trend, is that due to the sinking of the land and other natural causes, there will be some sea level rise in Hampton Roads without any additional mitigating factor of about 1.5 feet over the course of this century for the next 90 years or so. However, VIMS did 3 projections. They did a low projection, a high, and a highest based upon climate change-induced sea level rise. And the current pace says that we're on pace for about that high line, the yellow that you see behind me, which is about 5 feet or so of sea level rise in Hampton Roads by the end of the century. Now, looking at one particular neighborhood that's called The Hague in Norfolk, the VIMS also tracked the number of hours that The Hague has flooded since 1920-ish through 2010. And as you can see, the trend is undeniable. That climate change, sea level rise is getting worse, and there is a stark upward trend. Now, think about what this chart behind me will look like in 50 years from now, 70 years, 80 years, with 3, 4, or 5 or more feet of sea level rise. So just think about what that will do to neighborhoods in Norfolk. And unfortunately, I don't think you have to think too much or get too imaginative, but just think back to 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. Now, Hampton Roads has been named the second most vulnerable area in the nation to sea level rise, second only to low-lying New Orleans. Now, we know that climate change makes storms more severe and also more frequent. Hampton Roads has about 1.7 million residents. So imagine a storm like Hurricane Katrina, or smaller, or larger, within the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. With an additional 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise. So more intense storms, more water, higher storm surges. Imagine what that's going to do to neighborhoods, to localities. Homes destroyed, lives lost, memories washed away. This is a significant, significant problem that Hampton Roads is dealing with now and will certainly have to deal with in the future. And so, thankfully, something is being done, and we are seeing some progress on this front. And so, we'll talk about some of the work that we're seeing here in Virginia. In 2012, the General Assembly decided that it was time to take this phenomena seriously, and they passed a bill to study sea level rise that was eventually stripped Any mention of sea level rise or climate change was substituted for the phrase recurrent flooding because it was more politically palatable. Climate change and sea level rise was coined a left-wing term, so we have to use a politically neutral word like recurrent flooding. I wish I was making that up. I am not. And they are studying sea level rise, recurrent flooding in Hampton Roads. As a result of this and other efforts, during the next General Assembly session in January, Senator Locke and Delegate Stolle will put in a bill to study or to have a committee to further look at recurrent flooding in the area. And so what this committee will do is that it will have 15 members, 8 legislators, 7 non-legislators, 1 member from the environmental community. I cannot wait to find out who that lucky soul will be to be a part of this committee. The committee will meet for 2 years, and they will come back with concrete recommendations about adaptation policies in Hampton Roads. But we also have a new governor, and McAuliffe has pledged a new climate change commission. Whether it's different, the same as Governor Kane did, not really sure, but at least on his website and what he has said to do is to research into not only adaptation but also the causes of climate change and what we are seeing in Hampton Roads. So that's certainly comforting to me. We will see, as was mentioned, politicians sometimes change their minds, so we need to do what we can to influence the General Assembly and hopefully the executive to look more seriously about this very, very pressing issue that we're seeing in Hampton Roads.